reflects a little bit of my background and history in Washington, D.C. And this is probably about 20 years ago. I was at a Foggy Bottom Metro waiting for the train, and an African-American guy approached me on the Metro, and he said, do you speak Spanish? I said, yes, I speak Spanish, but I'm not Hispanic. I said, oh. Then he looked around, and he sort of leaned in, and he whispered, and he says, well, are you black? I said, well, I'm mixed, I'm from the Caribbean. He says, oh, you're black and white. Then he walked away, but I was so struck. See, and these are some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today, sort of the elasticity of blackness and the constructed nature of race and identity and what it means for us here in Washington, D.C., those of us who were born and grew up here, and those of us who've made Washington, D.C. our home. So I'm very, very excited to explore these topics today. And we're going to start with Dr. Ginetta Candelario, who's an associate professor of sociology and Latin America and Latin studies at Smith College. So I'll hand it over to you. Welcome.
I'm actually going to stand, and I wanted to say thank you, of course, to our moderator. I wanted to thank Portia James, who was actually my mentor at the Anacostia Museum. And I wanted to thank Ariana Curtis and Tiffany Ates for, can you hear me okay?
Can you try to use the mic because we're trying to record?
Oh, okay. How's this? All right.
Perfect.
And Tiffany for all the logistical arrangements, and of course, all of you for being here today. So I was thinking about what I could possibly contribute to this conversation, and I thought I would begin by telling you why I'm in the conversation today, which you may be wondering. 16 years ago, it turned 16 and a half almost exactly, and I know because my son was an infant and I brought him with me to DC, and he's just turned 16 recently. I was at the Anacostia doing a fellowship, which itself was a product of having attended a 2-week training seminar on qualitative methods in Latino studies at the museum that was run by the Center for Museum Studies at the Smithsonian Institution as part of a program of the IUPLR, the Inter-University Program for Latino Research, which at the time was directed by Gilberto Cárdenas, who's now at Notre Dame. And Professor Cárdenas and my professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center, Juan Flores, were co-collaborators in developing this qualitative research methods initiative at the Smithsonian, which was hosted by the CMS, and Magdalena Mieri, who's here today, also was critical to that. And that was my first introduction to the museum and to public history as a site of research and as a repository of archival knowledge. I was in a sociology Ph.D. program at the CUNY Graduate Center. And my topic was the question of Dominican racial identity, thank you very much, in the United States. That topic was mine, by the way, because I am the daughter of a Dominican exile, an exile of the Trujillo regime, who then became a Dominican immigrant in the 1960s. And I was made and born in Brooklyn, New York, as a result of her exile. My father is Italian, which accounts in part for my physiognomy and my appearance, but I was raised by my mother, my Dominican mother. And that context of growing up between Brooklyn and the Dominican Republic and subsequently Hudson County, New Jersey, looking this way but being very much a part of a Dominican diasporic and quite often a Latino and Afro-diasporic set of communities, informed the questions that brought me to a PhD program in sociology and a dissertation on this question of Dominican racial identity in the United States and in the Dominican Republic, and really trying to make sense of the kinds of discourses that Dominicans deployed, both privately and publicly, about their relationship to Blackness, to indigeneity, to Hispanicity, et cetera. So when I was selected as one of the participants in this Latino Studies Qualitative Methods program and was exposed for the first time to the work that had been done at the Anacostia Museum in Black Mosaic through the participation of a man named Héctor Corporán, who was the researcher at the Anacostia who worked to bring Dominican voices and Afro-Latino voices into the Black Mosaic. He presented, along with Steve Newsome, at this 2-week-long qualitative research methods in the museum Latino Studies Initiative. And I was stunned to learn as a second or third year graduate student that there were not only Dominicans in Washington, D.C., but that they were Black identified. And I said, okay, wait a minute. Who are those Dominicans? Because the research I've been doing so far in New York City and in the Dominican Republic and in my own family really highlighted and was of a piece with the narrative of Dominicans being profoundly negrophobic and profoundly embracing of an identity that rejected their relationship to Africanity and Blackness, et cetera. So I wanted to know who were these folks and, you know, why are they in DC and what accounts for this particularity, this uniqueness. So that question first arose during the 2-week seminar, and it inspired me then to apply for that fellowship at the Anacostia, which I'm eminently grateful to have received. And it allowed me to spend 3 months, more or less, I think it was, under the mentorship and tutelage of Portia James and other folks at the museum. And to go back and look at those boxes, those archives, because I came in 98, the exhibit was in 94. And more importantly, for me, I think, to re-interview the Dominican participants in the Black Mosaic, each of whom was wonderfully willing, including Carmen Kwanda, who didn't remember me, but who's actually profiled in my book, to allow me the time to re-interview them, right? And to ask the question more pointedly, how did this come to be? How is it that you, as a particular group of Dominicans in the United States, navigate the relationship between African Americanness, Latinidad, Dominicanness specifically, et cetera. And it was incredibly informative and enriching, and it formed actually a core part of my book, which I will talk to you about. And it actually won me a prize because I wrote an article for the Public Historian about the Dominicans in the Black Mosaic and won the prize a couple of years later. So thank you to all those folks. So what that experience did, apart from being incredibly illuminating to me and expanding my own sense, my own, it turns out, distorted sense of what Blackness in the Americas meant and of what Dominican identity meant, was that it led me on this path of really researching more deeply the relationship historically between Dominicans, U.S. African Americans, and the Afro-diasporic experience in the Americas more broadly, which is what my current project is actually on. So that first book was called Black Behind the Ears, which is an English translation of a Dominican expression, which is we are all black behind the ears, todo tenemos el negro tras la oreja. It is the title of the chapter that I wrote about DC, and the second part of that chapter title was An Upfront Too, Black Behind the Ears, and Upfront Too, that's the Dominicans in DC. It led me then to think more fully about this longer history. And so my new project now is on Dominican women's feminist activism, both intellectual and discursive activism, but also social movements. And it turns out that there are longstanding, deep and historic ties between Dominican women's feminism, that is to say, a challenge to patriarchy and patriarchal violence and a notion of women as full human beings, and African American women's club movements and the Black abolitionist and anti-lynching movement. So that's the story I'm currently working on writing. It's what I'd like to tell you a little bit about because DC, as usual, figures prominently in that story. So I'll just take a few minutes. I have 10 left, probably, 10 or 15. Would you just keep me on track? Because I love this story, so I'll take too long with it, and I'm going to try really hard to keep it simple. So just for those of us who need a visual reminder, right, the Dominican Republic was born on the same island as Haiti, subsequent to Haiti, actually, as part of a series of revolutionary anti-colonial projects. You can see that they still share the island today in more ways than one, and that it is really the center of the Caribbean. Folks like Silvio Torres Saliant, who's a professor at Syracuse University, which is a core part of the story, have called Hispaniola, Quisqueya, Santo Domingo, the cradle of Blackness in the Americas, because it's on this island that the Black diaspora in the Americas really emerges, right? This is the site of all the first, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? The first sugar-based slave plantation, the first ingenio, the first European university, the first European city, forts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And it's from here that the project of expanding chattel-based slavery, utilizing West African human beings, is really developed, refined, and dispersed throughout the Americas. So the story that I was telling in Black Behind the Ears was really trying to make sense of the relationship between the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and the United States as a triangular kind of relationship, and of course its relationship to Hispanicity as it's conceptualized in the rest of the Americas and also in Spain, in Europe. Okay. But the other parts of the story, though, more interestingly, I think for our conversation, is specific relationship between these diasporas and places like Washington, D.C., New York City, and increasingly interestingly to me, the Niagara area, that is to say, Western New York, Buffalo, right, birthplace of the Niagara movement and the NAACP. So I want to enter the story by telling you a little bit about a local Washington, D.C. family, the Goines family, whose papers are held at Howard University in the Moreland Spingarn archives. The family really is a Southern origin family in the sense that one of the patriarchs of the family, Jermaine Wesley Lugan, was a runaway slave who had been born in Tennessee and made his way to central western New York, where he established himself as a core member of the Underground Railroad, right, in Syracuse, and was ultimately ordained a reverend in the AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church. And he lived throughout the upstate region of New York, including Ithaca, where my daughter's now a student, you know, so I felt like a connection to that, Utica, and Syracuse. And Reverend Lugan was also very close friends with another famous abolitionist runaway, Frazier-Douglas, okay, which will become part of our story. Reverend Lugan marries Caroline Elizabeth, who was born and raised in upstate New York to a free family, and they have several children, but the one who figures in our story here is Sarah Marinda, who was born on January 29th, 1850. Sarah Marinda married a man from St. Thomas named Charles Frazier, Charles Alexander Frazier, as it happens. And together they had a daughter named Gregoria Frazier. Now, how did that happen? And why do we care? Well, Jermaine Wesley Lugan and Carolyn Storgum Lugan, as you can see, there's a lovely book, by the way, which if you want to read this story more fully, Three 19th Century Women Doctors, which profiles Sarah Marinda, met and married and had their progeny, Sarah Marinda Lugan Frazier, who was the fourth African-American woman to attain a medical degree in the United States from Syracuse University College of Medicine. And there she is in the center. Okay. When she attained that degree, she practiced in a series of places in the United States, including Philadelphia, but ultimately she ended up practicing here in Washington, D.C. Why D.C.? Because her sister, Amelia, was married to Lewis Douglas, Frederick Douglass's youngest son, with his first wife, Anne Murray Douglas. Okay, so these are the three Douglas sons, Charles on the left, Joseph, and Lewis. Lewis married Amelia. Amelia settled in Washington, D.C. Her sister Sarah, who was unmarried, joined her and established her practice here on 13th Street Northwest. In fact, Frederick Douglass, her sister's father-in-law, helped hang up the shingle in her practice. Frederick Douglass's other son, Charles, right around the time this was happening, was in the Dominican Republic, because Charles, along with Frederick, had accompanied the U.S. Senate Commission to Santo Domingo, put together by Ulysses S. Grant in 1871 to consider the question of annexing the Dominican Republic to the United States. And Douglas and Charles were both secretaries to that commission, which was chaired, by the way, by the president of Cornell University. So here's Ithaca again. Okay. This is an image of from a travel narrative of Frederick Douglass's speech to descendants of the African-American settlers in Samaná, which is a region of the Dominican Republic, where, by the way, the AME also had a long-standing established church, which is still there today. There are still descendants of that colony of African-American settlers who came during the Haitian unification period, who still speak a 19th century inflected version of English, as well as being third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation Spanish-speaking Dominicans. In any case, Douglas ended up supporting the notion of annexing the Dominican Republic, much to the surprise of many, for reasons that I won't go into here. And he was ultimately named the consul to Haiti, right? African-American consul in Haiti at the turn of the century. His son, Charles, was the consul to the Dominican Republic, and he settled in Puerto Plata, which was a northern port city, one of the major port cities of the country. So if we were to go back to this map very quickly, Puerto Plata is right here, and this is Samaná. Santa Ana is one of the cities in Samaná. So this is where Charles was. This is where his father was meeting with the African-American free community that had settled there in the 19th century and still remained. And so they had a sense of familiarity with the country and a set of ties to the African-American, the US African-American diaspora in the Dominican Republic. So when Charles Redmond Douglas settled in Puerto Plata and was US consul, his father, Frederick, would visit him there. And as English-speaking, in other words, Anglo-African Americans, they were part of a broader British West Indian or Anglo-diasporic community in Puerto Plata, including folks like Charles Alexander Frazier, who had moved to Puerto Plata from St. Thomas to establish his apothecary, his pharmaceutical practice. And now, advanced in years in his late 40s, decided that he was finally ready to have a wife and settle down. And while he was chatting about this with his friends, the Douglases, who were also English-speaking folks, they mentioned their good friend, Sarah Marinda, who was single, attractive, and in Washington, D.C., and possibly willing to move to the Dominican Republic. Another friend that they had in common, because as a doctor, the sort of professional linkages between her work as a practitioner and his work as a pharmacist made a whole lot of sense, right? Now, they had another friend in common, General Gregorio Luperón, who also was a descendant of British West Indians and Dominicans, who spoke 3 languages, possibly 4. Well, we know for sure he spoke English, he spoke Dominican Spanish, which is its own language, and he also spoke French and Creole. Okay? And it was very much part of the moment in the Dominican Republic that was about establishing not only sovereignty, and therefore, by the way, he was vociferously anti-annexation, disagreed with his friend Frederick Douglass profoundly. No, thank you. We don't want to repeat a colonial project in the Dominican Republic. We've just come out of 2 or 3 attempts at colonization by the Spanish, by the Haitians, by the French, by the British. Everyone wants us. We'd like to have some sovereignty and some nation-state formation at this moment in the 19th century, although we appreciate the thought, Frederick. We'll stick with sovereignty, and we will, however, borrow from the United States a notion of republican democracy based on constitutional, institutionalized political succession rather than military armed warfare, which was really the rule of the day in the Dominican Republic. Repeated military coups and caudillismo, in other words, strongman politics, right, which has been characterized as the cockfight of the 19th century by folks like Michelle Walker. That meant that Gregorio Luperón came to Washington, D.C., for example, and lobbied U.S. congressmen and senators when they were considering the question of annexation against annexing the Dominican Republic, and worked actually with folks like Douglas and other African Americans and suffragists, right, white and African-American women who were really honing in on this question of sovereignty, personal sovereignty, gender-neutral sovereignty, and national sovereignty, right, as a shared set of projects that had to be all in line in order for this claim to democracy to really be substantiated. So these folks were part then of a broader Afro-diasporic liberation movement, right, that looked to the state but also tried to intervene in the kind of state that was being formed in the United States, but also in places like the Dominican Republic, which found itself situated in a subordinate, dependent, peripheral relationship to the US. And that really ended up mattering a lot and was part of why Gregorio Luperón, for example, and Frederick Douglass would disagree profoundly on this question of the appropriate relationship between the 2 countries. Okay? So here's Sarah Marinda at the family apothecary. By the way, she and her husband Charles ended up owning quite a bit of property in Puerto Plata. They owned several homes that they rented out. They owned a plantation. They owned the apothecary. She had a medical practice, etc. And she was, as I said, the first woman licensed to practice medicine in the Dominican Republic, where she had an obstetrical and gynecological practice. And so there she is with some of her workers and employees. Charles and Sarah had a daughter, Gregoria, named in honor of Gregorio Luperón. Gregorio, it's kind of an unfortunate name if you ask me, but Gregoria for Gregorio, Alejandria for her father's middle name, Alexander. Her godfathers were Frazier-Douglas and Gregorio Luperón. Okay, so she was very much a child of these multiple diasporas and these multiple liberation movements. She and her mother remained in the Dominican Republic until 1897, I think it was, 96. When her father passed away in 1894, Sarah Marinda continued to run her practice and to attempt to sustain her life and livelihood in the Dominican Republic. But when Gregorio Luperón died in 1896, it seems that Sarah Marinda found herself without any real sort of protection or support in a society that was profoundly patriarchal and violent, to be completely honest with you. So despite having spent over a decade in the Dominican Republic, despite having fully integrated herself into the community in Puerto Plata, and more importantly, into the sort of liberal, progressive, feminist, abolitionist, sovereignty-based community of Puerto Plata, she returned with her young daughter to Washington, D.C. And this is an image of Gregoria from a production of The Star of Ethiopia in The Crisis that's featured. Gregoria goes on, by the way, to go to Syracuse University to study music. She lives in Europe for a while, and she eventually returns to Washington, D.C., settles here, establishes a music school, and marries a man whose first name I'm blanking on right now, but Mr. Goines, who she is married to for about 10 years until he passes away. She and her mother remain in Washington, D.C. For the remainder of their lives in the early 20th century. Now, this is an image of feminist school teachers in the Dominican Republic, in Santiago specifically, who were part of this feminist project of the Dominican Republic. This woman, Mercedes Mota, was a school teacher in Puerto Plata, and in all likelihood, Gregoria's schoolmate. Okay, because they were contemporaries. And she was part of this transnational Dominican feminist conversation, right, that was sort of represented by the Frazier-Douglas Luperón connection. But she was very explicitly part of an agenda by turn-of-the-century Dominicans like Pedro Enrique Ureña, the son of Salomé Ureña, to directly engage with the United States public officials against U.S. intervention, which was very much part and parcel of the relationship between the two countries. And she does this by coming to speak at the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901 as part of the International Council of Women's meeting there. Also meeting in Buffalo was the National Council of Negro Women, and specifically spearheaded by Phyllis Wheatley, the Phyllis Wheatley Club of Buffalo, which was founded by Mary Talbert, who you may recognize as one of the founders of the project to make the Frazier-Douglas House a National Historic Site. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but basically what I wanted to sort of signal to you is that the project I'm working on now, which was very much born of the Black Mosaic of DC and understanding DC's central role, not only in African American history in the United States, but Afro-Latin American history, and in specifically Dominican history, and even more importantly, to my mind, feminist and liberation projects within that history, between the sort of upstate New York, Washington, D.C., and the Dominican Republic, embodied literally in the work of these women, right? These groundbreaking women and their male allies. Okay, so I'll leave it at that because I want to hear from our more contemporary presenters. But I guess the final word from me is to understand that DC presence, Dominican presence in DC, Afro-Latin American connections is not new. Okay. It's long-standing, and it has been profoundly impactful, even if unrecognized historically, right, in all the kinds of projects that we have mutual stakes in here. So that's a cover of the book. I do have copies of the Black Mosaic article, only a few for those of you who are interested in that, and I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ginetta. I think that was a wonderful illustration of the power of storytelling and making the connections between Dominican Republic, D.C., and the Douglas legacy. So wonderful. Thank you. We're going to go on to our second speaker, Dr. Clarence Lusane, he's a professor of political science and international relations at American University. Clarence?
Thank you. Good late morning to everyone. Like Ginetta and Fred, I also want to thank the organizers for pulling this together. It's, personally good because I got a chance to see a lot of old friends. I hadn't seen Portia James in a number of years, who's a really, really dear friend of mine, and a number of people who have come. And I want to thank the first panel that I listened to upstairs because it was really phenomenal, and it was really good to get the broad array of perspectives that people were able to contribute. As mentioned, I teach at American University, and specifically my area of focus is global race relations. And when I'm not here in Washington, I'm usually in either Latin America, Europe, or Asia looking at these issues. I'm also a commissioner on the D.C. Commission on African American Affairs. There's another commissioner here, John Franklin, as well. You may not have heard of the D.C. Commission on African Affairs because it's only about a year old. And part of the reason the D.C. Commission on African American Affairs exists is because the changes that are going on in the city. There was a sense that there was no need for a D.C. Commission on African American Affairs up until now. But that has changed as the city's dynamics have changed. Like Fred and like Ginetta, I want to begin with the story. I keep telling my wife in about 30 years when I write my memoirs, somewhere in the title is going to be Adventures in Blackness. And so I want to share one of those adventures with you. In June, I found myself in Ukraine. And how I ended up in Ukraine is a bit of a story itself, but I had a call from the embassy, and they said, we want you to come to Ukraine to give a series of lectures on civil rights and human rights. And I said, well, let me think about it, and I talked over with my wife. And this was June, right when the war was starting to escalate. So I got back to the embassy and said I would come under two conditions. One condition is that you don't fly me in through Russia. I was living in Japan at the time, and so the easiest way would have been to fly me from Japan to Moscow to Ukraine. But, it's on my list of travel of pack your toothpaste, take your camera, don't fly over war zones, right? So I said, that's just not going to work. So they said, okay, so I literally had to fly to Austria. Had to go kind of all over to get there. And then the second condition was that, because where we were going to have the meetings were in the western part, was that they would fly me into the capital, and I would spend 3 days there because I wanted to meet with some of the black people in Ukraine. And they said, okay, and they actually knew some of the people. There's an organization there called the Africa Center, which is the main organization there that's been an advocate and a fighter for rights of African immigrants and black people in Ukraine. And last December, in a trip that brought over a number of Afro-Europeans, we also brought over the head of that Africa Center. And he had invited me to come. He says, when you come to Ukraine, please come to the center and, we'll show you around. And I was like, sure, okay, I'll be in Ukraine soon, right? So I had no plans, but, this opportunity arose, so I said, okay, let me go. So I got there, I met with the staff, and then I said, let's go out to the streets. I really want to talk to people. So he said, fine. Most of the African immigrants, a large disproportionate, and they're really having lots of other issues, but a large number of the ones who are in the capital in Kyiv work in the outdoor markets. And these are people with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, some who have law degrees. There's actually a fairly large number of African immigrants in Ukraine because Ukraine was one of the places where historically people went during the Cold War. Actually, even more so than to Russia. People came to Ukraine. So there's still a long history of people coming to Ukraine for educational purposes, primarily in eastern Ukraine. So they really are kind of in the fire. But a lot have settled in the capital as well. So I went out into the streets. We went to the markets, and I just met these guys. And it's mostly guys. There are a few women, but mostly guys. And I would talk to them. So the first guy I met, he was like, what are you guys' issues? What are you focused on? And he talked about this police harassment. They can't get the papers they need to work. They've got a range of issues. And he wanted to tell me that when I went back to Washington, D.C., to tell President Obama about their situation. I was like, okay, dude, right? So then, I went and met some more guys. They talked about the issues. They said, when you go back to Washington, D.C., talk to President Obama, right? So they were all saying this. And, in my mind, it's like, they don't really have a picture of how Washington, D.C. and presidency is organized, right? But, they really had serious issues, and I, really did want to come back, and I did talk to the embassy about putting pressure on the Ukrainian government, since it has leverage around some of these issues that are long-standing. Then I also met with a group of Afro-Ukrainians. So these are people who are of mostly mixed race, who are Ukrainian citizens. So I met with them. They also had a range of issues they wanted to talk about. And then at the end, they said, and I was like, are there any other issues? And they were like, yeah, we want to talk about these African immigrants. And I was like, am I in Washington, D.C. in Adams Morgan? Right, what's the deal here? And so, they were trying to figure out as well, how do they relate on a whole range of identities with this group that at some levels they connect with, right, because of the racism in the Ukraine, but at other levels, because of their very different status in society, they don't connect, right? So I'm raising this to show that these issues are not just here in Washington, D.C., but these issues of what I call intra-Black dynamics are really a phenomenon that goes on globally. And it means that not only should we look at our own experiences, but we should also try to learn from the experiences of other people as they're wrestling with these questions. Okay, so getting back more to our situation here, like a lot of people who have used the data from the census is the greatest source of information we have. It's also the worst source of information that we have, because the census does two things at the same time. It builds and it discourages racial boundaries. Now, if you look at the fine print in the census data, it says explicitly, if I can find it right quick, that basically race is a social construct. So it very clearly, they're very smart people that work at the U.S. Census. They know fully well that, this is an ongoing, constantly reconstructing process, and they put that out front. They don't put that on the census that comes to your door. Right? If you look at the census on your door, there are very hard categories that are put forth, and now you can check as many boxes as you want. But it reinforces these boundaries that we have. So as we use that data, we also have to be very aware of how the data also has some problems and some broader kind of limits. From 1990 to 2000, the Native American population in the United States grew by 26%. This is a pretty large number. From 2000 to 2010, the Native American population grew overall by 26%. But if you break it down to look at those who use Native American in combination with other racial identities, it grew by 39.2%, almost 40% growth. In contrast, the African American population, the Black population in the U.S., grew between 2000 and 2010 by 15%, from 36 million to about 42 million. If the Black population had grown at the same percentage as the Native American population, it would have been an increase in 14 million Black people. Right. So what accounts for the large growth in Native Americans? Was there suddenly a surge in births? No. Actually, the Native American population has the lowest birth rate of any of the racial groups in the country. was there an increase in Native American immigrants? Okay, this is a ridiculous question, right? It's just ridiculous at so many levels, right? So what accounts for this growth? 5 minutes. Okay, so the growth basically comes from individuals in 1990 and in 2000 who decided in those years that they were not Native American, but in 2000 and 2010 decided that they were. And what had happened was basically a cost-benefit analysis that said it's more beneficial to identify as Native American than not. And the lesson there is for African Americans or for a black identity, when it becomes perceived or the reality that is more beneficial to identify as black, then you will see people checking those boxes on the census, in school applications, on dating websites, all the different places where people right now will not check black identity for a range of reasons if they can get out of it. If there's an escape door, if there's a hatch that people can get through, they basically kind of go through it. The census now documents the third largest racial group on the census, some other race. First is white, first is black, then some other race. And 95% of the people who check some other race are Latinos, are Hispanics. So people go through the door when the door is there, and the door makes sense given how people see themselves in society. So let me make 3 quick points about what I, again, call inter-black dynamics. One is that there is a critical need for new theoretical frameworks to help us understand this phenomena. Something along the lines of interracial intersectionality, where we can look at not just the difference between the races as we have traditionally boxed them, but within multiple racial, multiple black communities, what are the dynamics that interrelate? And that in a broader context, as many have framed it, also at the historic moment that we're in, a moment of tremendous economic transition on a global scale, a moment of tremendous political transition, and a moment of tremendous demographic transition. So we need theoretical frames that help us understand that. We also need better approaches to how we deal with empirical data. There's a lot that we do know. The panel upstairs, and certainly my panelists here, can give all the data on the changes that are going on in terms of the doubling of people of African descent from Haiti, from Jamaica, from Ethiopia, from a number of places around the world. We have data on where people are coming from. There's a lot that we don't know. We don't know, for example, how old blackness and new blackness will share racial space. How will we deal with that particular phenomena? We do not know how racial pedagogies manifest within families and within communities. As someone mentioned, there's lots of interracial coupling and marriages that are going on, but we haven't examined within those communities that phenomena. And a third would be how does inter-black racism actually manifests itself. And then lastly, what I would mention is the political issues. And on what areas can there be unity, can there be coming together, and under what areas will we find ongoing divisions that need to be addressed? And particularly issues of political representation and whether or not within the political body that we have, you are able to get representation that crosses these lines within the black community. My fellow commissioner can tell you that within our commission, we had a major fight over whether or not black Latinos should be included under the rubric of the Commission on African American Affairs. A division we have not yet settled. Right, and that is manifesting itself kind of across the board. And then the last thing I would mention is that this is not all just internal, it's also external. There's a lot of resistance as these phenomena is happening, and these demographic changes in particular. I'm writing a chapter for a book now that I'm calling The Cognitive Dissonance of the Demographically Doomed. And what I'm looking at in that process is the ways in which People who are feeling the pressure of changes in this society are resisting in the way that's being exploited, particularly by political and economic elites who want to use that as a way of continuing a status quo that excludes people of color. So let me end there, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Clarence. That was wonderful. Wow, from Ukraine to DC, data, politics, and theory. Amazing. So let's go to our third speaker, Dr. Ginetta Washington Cherry. And she's with the Prince George's County African American Museum and Cultural Center.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. You have to excuse my voice. I'm getting over a pretty bad cold. But I am excited to be a part of the symposium. I think it's very important to celebrate 20 years of looking at Black diversity in this area. And I'm very excited to be on this panel in particular. My research, and what I'll talk to you about very briefly, due to time constraints, is my work in the area, but mainly in Prince George's County, Maryland. As many of you know, continues to be the largest predominantly Black county in the United States. And as Ginetta shared earlier, a lot of us come to this work based on personal investment, personal experiences. I have always been intrigued and fascinated by this notion of multiple Black identities. I am not from this area. I've been here about 15 years. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, where I came from two parents who both identify as Black, but one from southern part of Louisiana and one from San Antonio, Texas, with very different cultural identities and religious practices and cuisines, as someone was talking earlier in the earlier panel. So it was almost like night and day having the parents that I grew up with. But also I come from a line of educators, and my father was a musician. So we had this kind of experience of different people being in and out of the house. And when we traveled, listening to different music, listening to people talk and the different accents, I was always really interested about this when I grew up, as I was growing up. And I am the product of a historically Black college and university, Hampton University, actually. And and there, you know, as an adult, I've had colleagues ask, well, why didn't you think about going to a school that was diverse? Why did you go to an all-Black school? And I'm like, you can't get any more diverse than going to an HBCU. So a lot of these things informed my trajectory as an anthropologist and some of the work that I've done and continue to do. So very briefly, I'll talk to you a little bit about my research in Prince George's County, my work with the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center, and also very briefly my work with the American Anthropological Association. So my dissertation research I came to initially because I lived and taught middle school in Prince George's County, and I personally experienced the county as a diverse place with many different people, different histories, and different pathways to the county, contrary to how many people speak about Prince George's in everyday talk and also in the media. It's always positioned as that Black county in the D.C. Metro area, and that has a certain connotation. People don't think of the county as being diverse. It's actually very diverse. And I always challenge people that are in my circles and that are in my field to understand that being Black is not just one thing. It's many things. There's not just one Black culture, but there are many. As a former teacher, I taught middle school for 5 years. Some of this rhetoric about the county didn't sit very well with me. I felt like students, especially at the middle school level, were trying to figure out who they were, how they fit in socially, racially, and ethnically, and I watched these students struggle to express themselves as individuals. At the same time, they struggled to fit in, and they were consistently negotiating the multiple identities that they carried. I also thought that educators, including myself, didn't have a lot of support in understanding diverse classrooms, and so often these multiple Black and brown identities were being ignored. And this led me to do the field work that I did in Prince George's County public schools in a middle school as I was working on my doctorate. I was examining how social constructions of Blackness were being created, negotiated, and contested in a predominantly Black space among students and educators. So interestingly enough, one of the main questions that kept coming up during my research with students and educators was, what does it mean to be Black? How can you be Black? How can you look Black if you're not from here, if you speak a different language, if you have a Spanish surname, or if you are or are not a certain religion? In the same way that people were asking these questions, they're really focused on, well, why do you say you're Black but you don't look Black? People were very focused on the physical. And so my research ended up having a large focus on Afro-Latinos and how they negotiated these social constructions and what it meant for them to be Black or of African descent in a predominantly Black space in a U.S. racial context. I had the opportunity to spend 17 months in middle school observing, conducting interviews and focus groups with students and educators while working in classrooms with students. And in short, the data revealed that Prince George's County is indeed diverse. People are hungry to be able to share their multiple identities, their multiple Black identities, and welcome the opportunity to express their concerns in these discussions. Educators were also eager to have the space to talk about how they needed help in these areas and what they didn't know and how they could best support their students. In fact, some of these teacher sessions ended up being group therapy and healing sessions because it was the first time these teachers, some teachers having taught 30 years in the county, the first time they were able to talk about race in this way among their peers. And so, in short, that body of work, one of the things that became most interesting and most important was the fact that having multiple Black identities or having a different Black experience was in fact legitimate, where sometimes in predominantly Black spaces, some people think the ownership is on one particular experience. And so this research really grappled, I felt, with people legitimizing who they were in their own unique experiences. Moving forward a little bit, more recently, I have been working with the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center. Last year, I had the opportunity to provide context and rationale for an exhibit to be developed entitled Voices from the Diaspora, the Afro-Latino Experience in Prince George's County. This exhibit featured art and artifacts of self-identified Afro-Latino artists who are connected to Prince George's County. When we were trying to develop the idea for this exhibit, some questioned why would we have such an exhibit in Prince George's? And also pointing to the fact that there are many Central American immigrants in this area and people not understanding that even in Central America there are Afro descendants. But out of 65% of county residents who identify as Black or African American, based on the Census and American Community Survey, 10% also identify as Latino or Hispanic, which I feel is significant as we think about Black diversity or Afro-Latinos who exist in the county. This exhibit was one of the museum's most sought-after exhibits. We had a good turnout. It continues to be something that people ask about, and it served as an important teaching tool to county residents about the diversity that exists in the county, but also an important connecting tool to engage many different people who came to see the exhibit. Another exciting initiative I've had the opportunity to support at the Prince George's Museum is working with this program entitled Culture Keepers, which is a high school age art program that took place at Suitland High School. This year it'll be at 2 sites. It'll be at Suitland and Northwestern. The theme of Culture Keepers is a journey through the African diaspora and its diversity. And last year, the students at Suitland had a year-long exchange with students from Sao Paulo, Brazil, via social media, excuse me, and video conferencing. And at the end of the year, these students from Suitland, many who have never traveled outside of the D.C. metro area, got to go to Brazil for a week. And the Brazilian students came here at the end of their school year. And I must tell you, it was amazing for both sides to learn about diaspora in a different way, to get to engage with each other and find out their similarities and their differences, to talk about things such as skin color and other physical features in terms that they use to describe themselves. And I can honestly say that this experience that happened in Prince George's County and happened in Sao Paulo changed these students' lives for the rest of their lives, because now they have a broader idea about what it means to be Black, what it means to be a part of a diaspora, how their histories are different yet have commonalities, what the legacy of enslavement has done to both of these societies and the like. And the students had a joint art project that was at the end of this this exchange. And so they're expanding the program this year to be at 2 high schools, and it's very exciting. Not sure if the funds will be there just yet to travel outside of the country, but again, students are lining up to be a part of this experience. So that is very exciting. And lastly, because I think I have about 30 seconds left, I am also a project manager at the American Anthropological Association for the new public education initiative on migration and displacement. The program is in its early beginnings following the race project that came out of AAA. But one of the things that I hope to do is to really push an agenda of talking about multiple Black identities and Black migration in this larger scheme of what migration and displacement is on the table from the four-field anthropological approach. I think it's important, even though a lot of people don't understand that Black people globally are still in movement and trying to figure out these multiple ways of being, the tension that exists, but also the spaces of solidarity and the possibilities that we have in continuing these conversations on diasporic encounters. So in that, I will end. Thank you very much.
No, that's okay.
Thank you, Avenita. Some very, very exciting work, some good questions. How can you be Black and not look back, not look Black? You know, how can both sides learn about the diaspora? Questions around movement and displacement and identity. So some really good and exciting work. Let's move on to our final speaker. Semhar Araia is the Executive Director of the Diaspora African Women's Network. Dawn, Semhar?
Thank you. Well, as the last speaker, it's really tough to follow these amazing presentations, and I feel a bit overwhelmed by all the knowledge. It's already swimming in my head. So I'm going to try and stick to my remarks and some of the points, but I may deviate. My name is Semhar Araia. I'm the daughter of Eritrean immigrants who came to the United States in 1968. They came for school with full intention of returning back to Eritrea, which at the time was known as Ethiopia, but was in the midst of a struggle for its independence from Addis Ababa, 1961 to 1991, one of the longest wars for independence, internal African wars for independence. By the time I was born, it was the late 70s, and my educated Ph.D. seeking father and my mom, who was a nurse, moved and shifted between the worlds of education and employment to activism. So I'm also the daughter of activists. I grew up in the community center. I grew up exposed to the liberation, the quest for liberation, the global struggle, the global Black struggle, but also in the United States, what that meant for the struggle in this country. So as my consciousness was forming as a young girl and a grown-up woman, it also was inherently tied to my existence as a global citizen, as a Black American, as an African American, as a daughter of immigrants, as an Eritrean, as a fighter. And that, to me, is where the consciousness begins, is when you identify yourself as not just a fighter, but a change agent. And so my Blackness was inherently wrapped up in all of these worlds. I also ended up moving quite a bit throughout the United States. I had to write them down so we can remember all the places in terms of migration, what my parents and people like my family went through. Born in New York, lived in Boston, Grambling. My father was a professor at Grambling. Seattle, Minneapolis, Wisconsin, and D.C. I was exposed to D.C. 1987, roughly, when my mother moved here. What had happened was my family, like so many others, moved with the struggle. And until we were independent, we were based in New York. And because of family issues, we moved quite a bit. But upon independence, it was clear that we had to be here. because now we had an embassy, now we had representation, now we had work to do with the nation's capital. So my teenage years were formed around advocacy, lobbying, meetings with lawmakers. Met Senator Kennedy at the age of 7 in Boston. Then my mother would lobby Congressman Payne in the 90s, and the narrative was forming. So it's in this context that I'm here, and it's in this context that the Diaspora African Women's Network was forged. In terms of, this entity that is Dawn, on its face, it's a professional development organization. Okay, and I want to move to the presentation in a little bit, but before I do, what's important to note is that the challenge of existing as a diaspora in these many identities is really the power of not just storytelling, but also this concept of solidarity, and in our case, sisterhood, and I think most importantly, this notion of self-identification. And it's because of all these boxes that I have to check on the census that for us, the diaspora and the existence of being in the Afro-diaspora experience is about self-identification. It's because of the number of times people have told me what I'm not and what I've had to tell them that I am. And then you find out that you aren't alone in this journey, and that the migration and the experience that we have is ultimately so shared, so rich, so diverse. Who are we to say that there's one label? So after about 3 years of working in Eritrea, again, daughter of immigrants, but I moved back and did my part to help rebuild and help build this new country. It isn't finished. It's my life's work. But at the time, I moved for 3 years, and I found myself really challenged as to who I am and my identity, and what it means to be Eritrean, hyphenated American, Eritrean American. And it's there that I learned that I'm truly American as well, from my gestures, from my posture, from my confidence. What I knew that was culturally appropriate as an Eritrean didn't follow me through in the job in Eritrea. I was working as a lawyer, and in this case, an American lawyer. So I was challenged again, and it's upon that sort of final stage that I returned to the States and needed to find a collective network of individuals who fill these many shades that I constantly am managing. And it's not new, but I think what's new is that this is applying to a next generation. This is applying to a next generation of highly connected professional women who come from cultures and societies and communities that are still inherently very patriarchal, who are inherently removed from their homes and not entirely present in the world that they're in. What do I mean by that? Our feet are here and our hearts are back home. And so the children of these communities, the ones that grow up truly transnational in the way that I did, feel not only torn but planted in both. And it's that daily management of this existence, this duality, this multiplicity, this multiple narratives that have to follow you everywhere you go. Managing that and then applying it to the workforce is a double-edged sword, if you will. And I found that there were many people like me who were applying their personal stories like we do here, but doing so in a way that required a lot of movement back and forth to the continent. And it's this global nature of today's world, of what international development means. It means Africa in many cases. But in the nation's capital, there's an absence of us in these tables, in these meetings. And so when I returned and became a congressional staffer, it was astounding to me how few African Americans, how few people of color were coming to meet about Africa. It was in many cases the African immigrants who were directly affected, like my mother, like my parents, and in other cases, the African American circles who held on to the global nature of our reality, of our collective identity. So it's in this case that Dawn was formed, and I want to move to the slide now to show you who we are, what we're about, and then this is sort of where we come from. So Dawn, it's a membership-based organization, 250 women. It's a network of next-generation professional diaspora women who focus on African affairs. That last bit is the most important part. It's about creating a rich network of highly skilled sisters who can help each other move the agenda forward. And we represent 38 countries, from the continent to Latin America, United States, Europe. It is self-identification. So we have Afro-Latina, we have multiracial, we have Arab, we have, we're even open to the white South African and the South Asian Kenyan. It isn't about the racial or the physiology, it's about the connection and the narrative and the placement of their hearts and intentions. Our goal is threefold: to promote the role of the diaspora in Africa's development, to diversify the African affairs workforce, which we all know is severely needed, and of course to advance women's leadership in the workplace. Out of all these three goals, for me, the one that sticks the most closely is promoting the role of the diaspora in the continent's development, and keeping that nexus alive. And it came from this realization that despite the dramatic migrations and growth of our diaspora, as Clarence and others have alluded to, limited opportunities exist for our voices to be effective in shaping and contributing to the continent's growth. There are so many rich stories, but it hasn't been institutionalized in this modern day and context. And so with Dawn, our attempt is to try and introduce ourselves and showcase the different ways that we're contributing as one collective entity. And so our mission is to develop and support the next generation of African diaspora women. And this support is cyclical. It means that we learn from those that are before us, it means we learn with each other, and it means that we give to the next generation. So we have young women, we have experienced mentors of all backgrounds, people who have, many of you in this room need to come to me later. We need to talk, because I know that the women of Dawn would be profoundly inspired to just learn from everyone here. And the vision is ultimately for Africa to be guided by its citizenry, its people, to shape outcomes that advance the continent's progress with women at the helm of the decision-making process. And this notion of gender leadership is simply rooted in the fact that it's about equality at the end of the day, and it's about the universality of people's power, and where women are kept out of these spaces, we have to ensure that it comes in. Someone asked me the other day if I'm a feminist. And of course I'm a feminist. I'm a feminist because I want to be able to walk into a room and not be objectified, all right? I want to be able to walk into a room and be given the same level of respect that my male peers get, and that until that day comes, until that day that we can all say that, I will be a feminist. So that's how Dawn became also a women's group, because many of us walked into these communities and our fathers, our elders, our brothers, they weren't listening to us. Mm-hmm. They were looking at us. They were visualizing us. It wasn't what was in front, and it wasn't what is in here. And so if we can showcase the richness of women's strength and smarts, but also the diversity, then that can actually level the playing field a bit more. So we've got some testimonials, but I'm going to skip through those. We're all these things: leadership, professional development, mentorship, promoting effective engagement with the diaspora. And that's a lofty word, but it essentially is working with governments, NGOs, businesses, employers, and communities about where the power lies with the diaspora as change agents. And so this is beyond remittances. This is beyond one story at a time. This is around all the different sort of holistic approaches that we have to the continent and to this city. A bit on what we do. It's a lot of connecting. I hope what is coming through all this is that it was born in D.C. because this is the pulse for the continent, but also for the country and for our history. And it's in this pulse that I found many, many, many women who were not daughters of immigrants, who were multi-generational African diaspora women, who felt just as much a kinship to their home states and their continent in the way that I did. And this is a bit of our diversity, everything from Cape Verde and Latin America, everything from Latin America and the Caribbean to throughout the continent. These figures are rough. This is the diversity of where we stand, and it spans all professional careers. It isn't just policy, as DC is usually known for. And, being the daughter of African immigrants, we know that African immigrants are most likely to hold an undergraduate degree of all the immigrant groups, that we come from these educated spaces and we're applying it. And what we look for in our organization is really about leadership and professional criteria. The nationality component is self-identification, so it's not as imperative that it's explicit in the way we know it. We have a member who in her application, she wrote USA, you'll like this, USA, Guatemala, and Ukraine. And we looked at the paper and just went, what do we do about this? How do we gauge, her connection to the continent from a personal space? And what it was her career is entirely around Africa, and she identifies herself. And who are we to say, right? It's amazing you said Ukraine. So we now that I think about it, yeah. And this quote strikes me. I am most proud of Dawn's unrelenting efforts towards unifying diaspora women, providing mentorship through camaraderie, and highlighting our achievements in the U.S. and in Africa. I am also privileged to mingle and network with amazing women who, through their stories, remind me of just how connected we all are. So it's in that spirit of solidarity, sisterhood, self-identification, and storytelling that Dawn is holding on to who we are in this country through the headquarters here in Washington, but also moving around the world. I want to thank you. Some of our experiences have taken us very near and far, including the chance to sit with the President, Barack Obama, and share some of this diaspora organizing in this current context. We've been fortunate enough to also have the recognition from the African Union and the United Nations for these efforts in the current context, and it's an honor. And thank you.
Thank you, Semhar. That was wonderful. Can we just vote already? This has been the best panel ever. Wow. So I'm conscious of the time, so what I'd like to do is just open it up for comments, thoughts, questions. I don't know that we'd have time to engage in the discussion right now, but we have lunch and the rest of the day. So let's get reactions, thoughts, questions out. So we have, Allison has a microphone. Yes, please. And if you could just give your name and affiliation if you'd like.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This was a really, really great panel. My name is Nicole Kerlock. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and I really, really enjoyed the panel. And a question I have for either one of you, if you'd like to answer, is to me, identity politics are kind of like the Lord. They giveth and they taketh away, right? So I wonder if some of our issues with inclusion and exclusion are actually a symptom of the problematic nature of identity politics in the first place, or if maybe we can be thinking outside of sometimes really limiting notions of blackness in the first place, right? That it's kind of inherently essentializing, though politically expedient, right? And so no one's kind of taking that importance away from identity politics, but are we to a point that all of the discussion about inclusion and exclusion, and who is and who isn't, becomes a symptom of maybe that we're in fact maybe in need of a new heuristic, right, of understanding our connection to each other, right?
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Yes, please.
My name is Carmen Terrella.
The microphone's coming. Carmen. Microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask, I'm not going to call you by your first name, Dr. Candelario. How is your information, what you presented here today, how is that received by the Dominicans in the United States? Okay. And you can ask also the Dominicans in the Dominican Republic, but I'm mostly concerned about those in the United States.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Now's your chance. Yes, please. We have one in the back and another one here.
I actually just had a very straightforward question. I was interested in when both Dr. Candelario and Dr. Lusane's books are coming out.
Yes. Great, thank you.
My publisher wants to know, too.
We have another question here.
Thank you so much. This was a fantastic panel. I'd done some work a few years ago on Caribbean immigrants trying to think about philanthropy that was more than just remittances, but philanthropy in the way that we think about it here in the U.S. supporting advocacy. And so I'm just curious about, with any of the discussions happening, if there's conversation about replicating what I think the Chinese and folks from India and Scotland and others have done in terms of really harnessing the financial resources that are here to support movements happening back home.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was a question for my fellow Trini. The others, okay. So we have a number of questions, and we just go in order. So identity politics, inclusion and exclusion. How is your work being received by Dominicans in the United States? When are those books coming out? And looking at philanthropy and transnational philanthropy, are we looking at examples with the Indians or the Chinese? Is that informing our work? And how are we mobilizing around that? So would you like to start?
Yeah, I will say something about the identity question. In the earlier panel, someone asked, I forget which one of the panelists asked, who here is Afro-Latino identified, right? And, I did this, because, that I am Black identified. I am Afro-diasporic identified by virtue of my life experience as the daughter of a Dominican immigrant woman who grew up in Afro-diasporic neighborhoods, communities, and contexts. And at least until I was an adult and independently moving through the world, shared in the significance, the material consequences of being part of those Afro-diasporic households, neighborhoods, etc. But the fact of the matter is that I embody in a particular way, and I do not experience in this embodiment many of the indignities and consequences of being Black identified by others, right? So someone, for example, like me, and so one of the other things that came up in the panel was this, other category, which you also mentioned, Clarence. And I'm one of those folks who always checks other in the census, because I probably could check white in terms of appearance, but I refuse to, right? I don't want to be one of those Latinos who's going to be siphoned off into whiteness, right? Nor can I legitimately, it seems to me, check Black, because I don't necessarily appear that way to most people. Some people do see it. So it's about, for me, navigating that in-between space and saying I'm Black identified, in that I identify myself politically and biographically and intellectually with Afro-diasporic histories, movements, cultures, et cetera, of various kinds, multiple ones. But I also recognize the privileges of a certain kind of embodiment. That's real, and I have to be honest about that, right? That there's a safety embedded in looking this way as opposed to another way. At the same time, though, I often consider myself the ghost in the machine. Because since I'm often not read as someone who is Black identified, Afro-diasporic identified, or even necessarily immigrant, although apparently I have an accent in certain contexts, it allows me to be witness, right, to a lot of the discourse and decision-making that is precisely the background to the kind of harms and indignities that are made manifest more overtly towards certain people versus others, right? So there's a responsibility that I hold very profoundly to speak up constantly, all the time, and make folks uncomfortable who thought that because I was sitting in the room, they could get away with certain things, right? So that, to me, is the best kind of identity politics, right? The sense of sort of a political recognition, understanding, obligation, and alliance, allegiance. And just to, kind of wrap up what I think about this in terms of my own child rearing, because I have two kids who are Cuban and Dominican and also, look a lot like me. When I was trying to explain to them how I think about this, I said, okay, imagine, I've raised them in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is where my university, my college is at. And it's, predominantly white space. The largest minority is Latino Puerto Ricans who are in the neighboring community of Holyoke, with which I do a lot of work. But basically, my kids and I, if we're walking down Main Street, we're not going to be followed around in the CVS, and no one's going to, ask us for IDs and stuff when we present a credit card. So I said to my kids, look, picture it this way. We're on Main Street, and shots are fired. And all of a sudden, all the brown and, Black people are running that way, and all the white people are running this way. Which way are you running? I said, because mama's running that way, okay? I said, so you need to think about this, right? That's what we're talking about, right? When the pedal hits the metal, which way are you running, right? Who are you throwing your lot in with? And that, the safety might be that way with all the white people, but you have to decide. Right? So to me, that's the way I answer that question of identity politics. How is the research received? I think this is a continuation of that. Because I look this way, that I say this to Dominicans, in some ways carries much more validity and weight in both the Dominican Republic and in the United States. And I am presenting this work, have been doing so for 15, 20 years now. And in fact, I was recently invited to Lynn, Massachusetts, which has a large Dominican immigrant population, including folks who are now public officials, elected officials as mayors and so forth. And I was specifically asked to come speak on Dominican experiences of and articulations of racism, right? Both their experiences, but also the ways in which they themselves contribute to kind of negrophobic, discourses and practices. And so the work for me is always to remind us that while there is a kind of institutionalized and normative meta-narrative of Dominican relationship to Blackness, there has always been a group of folks in the Dominican Republic and its diaspora who were absolutely Black liberation thinkers, full stop, okay? The problem is that those folks haven't been able to really assume powerful positions inside the educational system, inside the governance systems of the Dominican Republic. That's changing in large part because of those of us who have been born and raised and educated here. People like Julissa Reynoso, for example, who is a Columbia University trained lawyer who was the lead counsel in the lawsuit that was brought by the Dominican Haitian Women's Organization against the state of the Dominican Republic for denying Haitian-descended and Afro-descended Dominicans their citizenship rights, okay? She's a U.S. Dominican, right? Junot Diaz is another example, and his incredible role as a public intellectual. I'd count myself in that. Nancy Lopez, there are a bunch of us, right, who are U.S. born or U.S. raised, either second or 1.5 generation, who are actively working to bring to bear, right, this historical understanding and this contemporary, understanding of ourselves as not appropriately represented by that dominant discourse, right, either in the U.S. or in the Dominican Republic. So that's the kind of long answer to those two questions. Oh, and the book, as soon as I finish writing it.
Great, thank you.
I'll just, the question I think about Caribbean philanthropy and how it resonates in the African diaspora philanthropy, this is a conversation that's being revived now, especially with, again, the rise of the internet and technology and the ability to send money back home, but also the ability to travel back and forth to do service projects in different ways. We actually hosted a conference a couple years ago on diaspora philanthropy in concert with the Global Diaspora Forum and the State Department, and we did it in Minneapolis, where there's a very rich immigrant community, but also multi-generational diaspora consciousness, oddly enough, in Minnesota. So it ended up including Norwegians, Liberians, Somalis, Filipinos, and also Ecuadorians, Mexicans, talking about what philanthropy meant. And it wasn't just the deliberate remittances. It was also service projects, short medical missions, cultural exchange programs, professional development opportunities, human capital, social capital. And so that conversation has yielded a lot of best practices to learn across different diasporas. But I think in the African context, we're beginning to unpack it again, because there's actually an organization, I'm an advisory board member of Africans in the Diaspora. AfricansInTheDiaspora.org seeks to harness and leverage the social, human, and economic capital of the African diaspora and its role in advancing the African continent. What does that mean? It means that the diaspora, in addition to investing financially through small-scale schemes, there's also larger, the impact investment space is becoming very interesting to African diaspora actors, but also legitimizing the need and importance for exchanges. Most notably for me, especially when it comes to philanthropy, it's a two-way street where the giving is actually when the diaspora go home and meet with civil society leaders and actually learn and understand the context of the environment and what the needs really are. Because oftentimes when in many cases, especially around development, the development actors, in this case the diaspora philanthropists, are assuming they know what the needs are, when in fact communities are ready to tell you what the needs actually are. So to me, there's also a very important responsibility in the diaspora that we have with understanding that we're a critical stakeholder, but we are not the solution or the protectors of a narrative. We're actually just contributors. And if anything, I would say we should be, it is imperative that we are always deferential to what civil society on the ground are saying. Outside of the state and the government and the country, national existence, I think where the eternal sort of identity politics unfolds is in the day-to-day civil society conversation. So associations, teachers, farmers, students, businesses, that activity is what drives the conversation. And those of us in the diaspora, especially now, we're running the risk of I mean, we've already been doing it, but creating an elitism of sorts. And in the philanthropy space, it's very dangerous if we do that. The other plug I have for Black philanthropy and broadly is the work of Jackie Copeland Carson, and who just stepped down from the African Women's Development Fund USA, but has an extensive experience and knowledge around what philanthropy really means in the Black context and how we give here and how we give back on the continent.
Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly, in terms of identity politics, at one level, this is a very personal question. And as we've all five of us up here have demonstrated, we look at it through the lens of, our own experience. But it's also, for me, an epistemological question. And the question that's there is, particularly related to race, do racial categories give rise to racism, or does racism give rise to racial categories? And where you come down on that question very much determines what strategy you evolve for dealing with these issues. If you think racism is the issue, then you don't focus that much on these what's often criticized as these, the narrowness of identity politics, because that's not really the target. The target is you have to address fundamental ways in which systemic institutional racism guides and directs, creates these racial categories, creates the tensions between these racial categories, and creates ways in which status quo gets reinforced. If you start from the perspective of, well, let's get rid of these racial categories, let's just take them off the census, let's stop calling ourselves Black or white or whatever, and everything will sort of flow into this post-racial harmonious universe, right? That, to me, is, just simply not going to work. So I think, it very much depends on making sure we don't lose the prize here and what we're really kind of targeting. In terms of the books, I'm actually working on two books. The first one's called Racialnomics, and it's looking at the ways in which African-American economies are being shaped by transformations in neoliberalism, global economics. And the second book I'm working on is called Dreams and Drones, King Obama and the Politics of the Nobel Peace Prize. And what I'm doing with both of those works, which are not completed, what I'm doing with both of those works is really looking at these intersections on a global scale of these dynamics of race and how they have evolved. With the first book is looking at how globally neoliberalism is shaping ways in which economies in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and everywhere else really function in a period where there's lots of migration, there's lots of other phenomena going on. In the second book, I'm using that as a window to get into looking at what I call diasporas, with a plural. That isn't just one diaspora, but they're actually multiple Black diasporas, and how those diasporas interact and affect each other, specifically looking at ways in which Dr. King had an international impact. Mostly what we focus on is what King did here, but King had a phenomenal impact. I'm going to deliver a paper in December in Japan looking at the impact of King's nonviolent philosophy on the Cultural Revolution and in China and on struggles for human rights in Vietnam, right? And then also looking at the impact of Obama, particularly in 2007 and 2008, on discourses and practices around race in the world. Arvanita was at AU around this time, and she was in one of my courses, and we talked about this whole process of, I took students to Brazil in the 2007, I think it was, and everyone wanted to talk about was Obama running for office, right? Because that had galvanized and mobilized racial discourses. And in fact, in 2008, because of a law that exists in Brazil that I don't understand how it came about, you can run under any name you want. And there were 8 people who ran under the name Obama. Right?
Yeah.
But this happened all over the world. It happened in Slovenia. It happened in Germany. It happened in Austria. It happened in Japan. So, it's looking at that phenomenon.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add, around that same time, I had gone, a little after that, I had gone to Anguilla and St. Martin, and the same thing.
hear you.
I'm sorry, apologize. Around the same time during the elections, I had gone to St. Martin and Anguilla, and the same thing. People had signs in their yards, Obama for president. People were engaging in this kind of dialogue, and it was just fascinating for me to see how invested they were. I just have one quick comment about the question about are the inclusion, identity politics coming to a new understanding of race? I would say, at least for the population I work with, I spend a lot of time working with youth. I think it's hard to come up with a new understanding when there's no baseline understanding or where there's very little historical context for some of these students, as well as some of the teachers that teach these students. And so I would just argue that keeping history on the table, understanding the structural issues that impact people's present day life circumstances and social conditions are extremely important, and to erase all of that, to erase racial categories, as complicated as they may be, is doing an injustice to a long legacy of people struggling and fighting for basic human rights. And so, again, I would just argue that we have to stay connected to the historical context that we're all a part of. So,
Great, thank you. So it's time to eat, but I want to pull this together very quickly in just a minute. And I sort of see, this has been a fascinating dialogue we've had, and I see 3 key themes coming out of it, for me at least. One around identity, multiple identities, self-identification, how we are identified by others, ownership of that, of one particular experience and what that means in terms of identification. And it was quite important for me that all of us spoke about connections to abroad, whether it's Ukraine, Dominican Republic, Brazil, Eritrea, Trinidad and Tobago, and what does this mean to be someone who identifies as having African connections in Washington, D.C. So a whole set of issues there that I think are very interesting. For me, a second point is we had a lot of conversation about movements, whether it was historical movements, political movements, social constructs, education, activism, and the role of solidarity therein. So that was another cross-cutting theme for me. And I would say finally was this question of representation. We talked about it in terms of art, artifacts, exhibits, in terms of storytelling, in terms of being in Washington, D.C., and there's an embassy here. There's that representation, academia, and workforce development, and mobilization, and civil society, and NGOs. And can I just say, this is the panel that has had the best academic titles. Black behind the ears, cognitive dissonance of demographically divided, dreams and drones, racialnomics. You can't get better than that. Thank you.